When Ava Gardner watched cancer take her own mother, a slow illness that had already claimed the one person who had believed in her potential before anyone in Hollywood ever did, she made a decision almost nobody expected from a star whose face appeared on more magazine covers than nearly anyone else working in film at the time. She walked into a London clinic years later and had a preventive surgery specifically to make sure the same disease could never do to her what it had done to her mother. That single choice, made quietly and without a press release, tells you more about who Ava Gardner actually was than any gossip column from her Hollywood years ever managed to capture. Most retrospectives about her focus entirely on what men did to her across 3 turbulent marriages, the infidelity, the cruelty, the violence. Almost none of them stop to examine what she herself actually chose to do in response, decision after decision, right up until the very end of her life, choices that reveal a far more deliberate and self-possessed woman than the passive victim so many second-hand accounts have reduced her to over the years. This is what Ava Gardner did, and nobody expected her to do it. Long before any of that, she was simply the youngest of 7 children on a struggling tobacco farm outside a tiny North Carolina community, raised in a household that later took in boarders just to make ends meet once money grew tight. A girl whose family lost their barn to fire, then lost their father to an early death in the middle of the Great Depression, and who had her sights set on secretarial work rather than acting when a photograph her brother-in-law displayed in his studio window changed everything. Her sister's husband worked as a portrait photographer, and after taking a series of pictures of Ava mostly just to showcase his own skill, he hung them in his shop front where passing strangers kept stopping to look. One of those photographs eventually made its way to a talent scout connected to MGM, who arranged for a screen test that went badly enough that the people running it could barely make out what she was saying underneath her thick Southern accent, a first impression that gave almost no hint of what the studio would eventually build around her. A talent scout noticed it. MGM signed her anyway despite that rocky start, and by 1941 she was on a studio payroll as a teenager with almost no formal training and an entire industry ready to reshape her into whatever it needed her to be. The studio put her through months of speech coaching just to soften that accent enough for microphones of the era, and she later admitted the whole process felt less like education and more like being quietly disassembled and rebuilt into someone the cameras would find easier to sell. What she actually did with that opportunity, and afterward, is where her real story lives, not in what happened to her, but in the choices she kept making in response to it. Studio executives spent years trying to keep her locked into a narrow range of seductress roles, the kind of part that traded almost entirely on her looks rather than any real dramatic range, and Ava pushed back against that typecasting whenever the opportunity genuinely presented itself. She actively sought out heavier dramatic material, landing an Academy Award nomination for her work in Mogambo, and earning genuine critical respect for performances in films like The Barefoot Contessa and later The Night of the Iguana, roles that required considerably more range and emotional control than simply photographing well under studio lighting ever demanded. She once described her own early career bluntly, admitting that none of the young actresses MGM signed in that era were hired because they could genuinely act. They were hired because they were good to look at, and she made it her own quiet project over the following decades to prove there was more to her than that initial assessment ever suggested. That same stubborn streak later carried her into politically charged material as well, taking a role in a Cold War-era political thriller alongside major stars like Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas at a point in her career when safer, more conventional parts would have been the easier, lower-risk choice for someone already worried about being taken seriously. She married comedian Mickey Rooney at 19, the biggest box office draw in the country at the time, meeting him on an MGM soundstage where he was filming a musical number and reportedly could not take his eyes off her from the moment she walked past. By her own later account, she genuinely had no idea what kind of marriage she was walking into. He had a reputation around the studio lot that she claimed she simply had not been told about before the wedding, one that plenty of people close to MGM apparently already knew, and once married, that reputation quickly became her own daily reality rather than a rumor she could dismiss. When infidelity on his part became something she could no longer ignore, even during a hospital stay for surgery, she did not stay quiet about it for the rest of her life the way many women of that era were expected to. Decades later, she put it in writing herself, in her own words, refusing to let studio publicity or anyone else control that part of her story. The marriage ended within a year, and Ava walked away from it rather than performing the happy Hollywood couple routine for cameras that no longer reflected anything real, a decision that cost her nothing socially at the time, only because she made sure the split looked amicable in public even while privately she had already moved on entirely. She did something similar, and considerably more surprising, during her second marriage to bandleader Artie Shaw, a relationship that began through a mutual friend, the actress Frances Heflin, and moved quickly from courtship into marriage in the fall of 1945, not long after Shaw had returned from wartime service riding a wave of fame as one of the country's most celebrated bandleaders. Shaw was intelligent, successful, and according to Ava's own later account, quietly cruel in a way that eroded her confidence for years, constantly suggesting she was not smart enough to keep up with him, needling her about her lack of formal education until she genuinely began to believe it herself, even as her own career continued climbing around her. Rather than simply absorbing that judgment the way plenty of people in her position might have, Ava went out and took a formal intelligence test on her own initiative, needing proof for herself rather than for him, telling almost no one beforehand what she was actually doing or why it mattered so much to her. The results came back high enough to put an end to years of quiet self-doubt Shaw had planted in her, and she treated that moment, by her own account, as one of the more genuinely liberating experiences of her entire life. Evidence she had gathered for herself rather than validation she waited around hoping someone else would eventually give her, proof that lived inside her own mind long after the marriage itself had ended. The marriage itself did not survive much longer regardless, ending in divorce within a year, with Ava later saying Shaw had moved on to someone else almost immediately once their first anniversary had come and gone. Her relationship with aviation tycoon Howard Hughes revealed another decision entirely, this time about what she was and was not willing to accept from a powerful man simply because he had money and influence on his side. Hughes pursued her relentlessly for years, showering her with the kind of resources few men in America could match: private planes, expensive gifts, round-the-clock attention, and reportedly paid for medical care during her mother's final illness, a genuine kindness Ava acknowledged plainly and never once tried to diminish in her later account. But she also later stated flatly that she never actually loved him, that whatever gratitude she felt never once translated into romantic feeling no matter how much he clearly wanted it to, and that his private views on race were something she found genuinely disturbing rather than something fame and money allowed her to conveniently overlook. She kept her distance from a serious relationship with one of the wealthiest men in America, a decision that ran directly against what most of Hollywood would have expected from a young actress in her position at the time, when marrying up in wealth and influence was treated as an obvious, almost automatic career move rather than a choice a woman was expected to weigh against her own actual feelings. Then came Frank Sinatra, and the choices tangled up in that relationship remain some of the most complicated of her entire life. She fell for him while he was still married, well aware of what that meant for his family and his public image, and by her own later account, their connection moved fast and burned intensely from the very beginning, once even ending an evening driving through the desert shooting out streetlights together purely for the thrill of it, the kind of reckless, exhilarating behavior that defined the earliest stretch of their romance. Once his divorce was finalized, they married in 1951, Ava in her late 20s and Frank considerably older, and the relationship almost immediately settled into a pattern of intense highs followed by equally intense fighting. During that turbulent marriage, Ava became pregnant twice and made the decision, on both occasions, not to continue either pregnancy, choices she later described in her own memoir as some of the hardest of her entire life rather than anything she treated casually or without weight, decisions made in the middle of a relationship that was already buckling under near constant conflict and public scrutiny. Whatever anyone thinks of those decisions today, she made them herself, and she chose decades later to name them honestly in her own words rather than let them stay buried or let someone else's version of events define what actually happened. An unusual level of candor for any public figure of that generation to volunteer about such a private matter. She also made the decision to end things with actor Robert Mitchum, a man she privately cared for a great deal and later described feeling genuinely drawn to during a period when her marriage to Sinatra was already unraveling under the weight of its own volatility. The moment she realized the entanglement risked real danger between the two men involved. According to her own account, when she finally told Mitchum that Sinatra also knew about them, Mitchum ended the affair immediately rather than risk a confrontation with a man capable of real violence over it, and Ava chose to let that ending stand rather than pursue him further once the danger became clear to both of them. Her relationship with actor George the 100th. Scott revealed perhaps the most important decision she ever made about her own safety. The two dated for a period that outwardly looked charming to fans and photographers who followed their public appearances together. But Ava later described a relationship that turned genuinely frightening behind closed doors, including one incident involving broken glass used as an improvised weapon that left her fearing for her physical safety in a way none of her previous relationships ever had. An episode, she said, was not an isolated one but part of a pattern that had already repeated itself before that particular night. Rather than staying silent about it forever, as an entire generation of women in her position were pressured to do, she eventually chose to put the truth of that relationship into her own record, on her own terms, decades after it happened, refusing to let it simply disappear the way similar stories from that era so often did. She also acknowledged elsewhere in her own account that she had ignored warnings from people close to her, including her close friend Lana Turner, about certain men she kept choosing to get involved with, an honesty about her own decisions that she extended even to the parts of her story that reflected less flatteringly on her own judgment. That same friendship with Lana Turner survived decades of gossip columns trying to paint the two women as rivals fighting over the same men, and Ava chose repeatedly to keep it intact anyway, refusing to let an industry that thrived on manufactured feuds between women dictate who she actually valued in her own life. By the late 1950s, tired of a version of herself that Hollywood publicity kept manufacturing for public consumption, Ava did something that surprised a studio system used to controlling its biggest stars. She packed up and relocated to Spain, immersing herself in bullfighting culture and a social circle that included writer Ernest Hemingway, choosing an entirely different identity for herself, an ocean away from the cameras that had spent nearly 2 decades deciding who she was supposed to be. Friends who knew her during that period said it was the first time since leaving North Carolina as a teenager that she genuinely felt at home somewhere, free of the constant scrutiny that had followed her everywhere in the United States, able to walk through a market or sit in a cafe without the same relentless attention that had defined nearly every public moment of her adult life up to that point. She stayed there for the better part of a decade before eventually settling permanently in London in 1968, deliberately building a private, quieter existence far removed from the industry that had made her famous in the first place, choosing anonymity in a foreign city over the version of fame she had already spent enough years living inside. Her financial choices later in life reveal another layer of the same instinct toward self-determination. As acting work slowed with age, in an industry that has never been kind to women once they pass a certain point, rather than quietly fading from view, Ava kept working through the 1970s in a string of large-scale disaster films and international productions, later admitting candidly that she took several of those roles mainly for the paycheck rather than any deep artistic passion, an honesty about her own motivations that few stars of her stature were willing to offer publicly at the time. She also moved briefly into television in the mid-1980s, taking a recurring role on a popular primetime soap opera, another practical decision that kept her working and financially independent well into her 60s, at an age when the industry had already written off most of her contemporaries as finished. Her final major decision may be the most telling one of all. In her final years, living quietly in London and facing mounting medical costs, Ava chose to sit down with British journalist Peter Evans and record hours of unguarded conversation for what was meant to become her own memoir, reportedly telling him bluntly that she would rather sell her own story than sell the jewelry she had spent a lifetime collecting, since parting with those particular possessions felt like giving up a piece of herself in a way that simply telling the truth never did. Partway through the project, she discovered Evans had once been sued by her former husband Sinatra, grew suspicious of his motives and his loyalties, and pulled back from the arrangement entirely, leaving the manuscript unfinished during her own lifetime. It was not published until 2012, more than 2 decades after her death, when those recorded conversations finally became the book the world would eventually read, meaning the woman who chose to speak her own truth into a tape recorder never actually lived to see what she had done make it into print. Reviewers who eventually read the finished book noted how unusually direct it was for a memoir of its era, closer to an unedited conversation between old friends than a polished celebrity autobiography, precisely because it had never been shaped or softened by the person it was actually about before it finally reached readers decades later than originally planned. In 1986, Ava suffered 2 strokes within the same year, severe enough to leave her partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly for a period afterward. A devastating turn for a woman who had spent her entire career being watched, photographed, and listened to by millions of people who felt they already knew her. According to people close to her at the time, Sinatra called her hospital room directly, and because she could barely talk, nurses simply held the phone against her ear so she could listen while he spoke, repeating, as he apparently had many times across the decades since their divorce, that he still loved her, and that growing older was harder than either of them had expected it to be. She reportedly kept an old photograph of the two of them from their earliest days together on her bedside table for the rest of her life, a small private choice that said more about where her heart actually settled than any headline from their marriage ever could. Accounts differ on exactly how much financial support Sinatra provided during those final years. Some say he insisted on covering her medical costs outright and arranging for her to see a specific specialist in Los Angeles. Others close to her estate maintain she remained financially capable of covering her own expenses the entire time and never actually needed his help. But every account agrees on one detail: he stayed present in her life until the very end, sending flowers every year without fail, regardless of what either version of the financial story actually reflected. She died in London in January of 1990 at 67 years old, and her body was returned to North Carolina to be buried near the family and the small farming community she had left behind decades earlier as a teenager, chasing a photograph in a studio window she never even knew had been taken, closing the distance between the girl from Grabtown and the legend the world had built around her one final time. Looking back across all of it, Ava Gardner's real story was never really about what Hollywood or the men in her life did to her. It was about what she consistently chose to do in response, taking a test to prove someone wrong rather than simply believing what she was told about herself, walking away from a wealthy man's affection because it did not feel honest no matter how much easier accepting it would have made her life, relocating her entire existence across an ocean to reclaim some version of herself the studios had never gotten their hands on. And finally, near the very end, choosing to speak the truth into a recorder rather than let anyone else write the version of her life that would outlast her. Every one of those decisions cost her something in the moment: comfort, security, a wealthy man's devotion, an easier public image, and she made each one anyway, fully aware of what she was giving up. That pattern, repeated across 5 decades and 3 very different marriages, says considerably more about her character than the glamour photographs or the gossip column headlines that have defined her public memory for most of the years since her death. And it is worth remembering the next time her name comes up purely attached to a list of famous husbands, rather than to the woman who kept choosing, again and again, exactly how she wanted her own story told. What surprised you the most? The choice to leave Hollywood behind for Spain, the honesty she finally put into her own memoir decades before anyone else got to read it, or the quiet medical decision she made to outrun her mother's fate before anyone even knew she had made it? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and let us know if you want more of the real stories hiding behind the icons everyone thinks they already know.